Picture this. The year is 1914, and the world sits on the brink of unprecedented conflict. A spark is about to ignite the powder keg that Europe has become. In the heart of Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated. This single act sets off a chain reaction of alliances, like dominoes falling one after another. On one side, we have the Allies, Britain, France and Russia, each with their own fears and ambitions. On the other, we find the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy, nations bound by treaties of mutual defense and shared interests. These major powers, drawn into conflict by a web of alliances and rivalries, are about to engage in what will be remembered as the Great War, a war unlike any the world has seen before. And with a single gunshot, the world was plunged into war. As the war intensifies, so does the horror and brutality of trench warfare. Picture, if you will, an underworld of mud and cold, a labyrinth of narrow, waterlogged trenches where men lived and died. The trenches were not merely holes in the ground. They were intricate systems, often with dugouts for sleeping, command posts, and even makeshift hospitals. The conditions were grim. Soldiers faced a constant threat of enemy fire, but it was not only bullets and shells they had to fear. The cold was a relentless enemy, gnawing at their bodies, seeping into their bones. Rain turned the trenches into quagmires of mud. Diseases like trench foot, caused by the cold and wet, were common. Rats and lice were constant companions, and the stench of death and decay was ever present. But it was not just the conditions that were brutal. The Battle of the Somme, fought in the summer and autumn of 1916, is a stark example of the horror of trench warfare. The British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, making it one of the bloodiest days in the history of the British Army. And then there were the new weapons of war. Tanks, first used in battle by the British at the Somme, were a game changer, capable of crossing trenches and breaking through enemy lines. Poison gas, unleashed by the Germans, brought a new level of terror to the battlefield. The effects were gruesome: blindness, blistered skin, and a slow, agonizing death by suffocation. Yet, amid the horror, there were moments of humanity and courage. Soldiers shared cigarettes, swapped stories, and even played games of football during lulls in the fighting. They cared for the wounded, comforted the dying, and mourned their fallen comrades. The war was not only a test of military might, but also a test of the human spirit. These men, living in the most horrific conditions imaginable, showed a resilience and a determination that is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The trenches were a hell on earth, but they were also a crucible, forging a generation defined by their courage and their sacrifice. In 1917, a new player enters the field, tipping the scales of the war. The United States, a nation far removed from the trenches of Europe, finds itself drawn into the conflict. Two key events precipitate this entry. The first is the sinking of the Lusitania, a passenger ship carrying American citizens by a German U-boat. The second, the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposition to Mexico suggesting a military alliance against the United States. The impact of these events is not to be understated. They stir the American public and Congress into action, culminating in a declaration of war against Germany. As fresh American troops pour into Europe, their presence bolsters the morale and capabilities of the beleaguered Allies. Their arrival signifies a turning point in the war, an influx of energy and resources that begins to shift the balance. With American troops on the ground, the end of the war comes into sight. The year 1918 brings with it the end of the Great War. As the year unfolded, it became clear that the Central Powers were losing steam. Eventually, an armistice, a temporary cessation of hostilities, was signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, bringing an end to the fighting on the Western Front. But the end of the war was just the beginning of a complex peace process. The world's eyes turned to Paris, where leaders from over 30 nations gathered to negotiate the terms of peace. The negotiations were lengthy, often contentious, and resulted in what came to be known as the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was, to say the least, controversial. It held Germany and her allies responsible for the war, imposing upon them the burden of war guilt. And with guilt came reparations, large sums of money to be paid by the defeated to the victorious. as compensation for the damage done during the war. The reparations were steep, crippling Germany's economy and stirring resentment among its people. The treaty also dictated territorial adjustments, stripping Germany of its colonies and certain strategic territories, further fueling the flames of discontent. The Treaty of Versailles was met with a mixed reception. Some saw it as a just response to the horrific atrocities of the Great War. Others, however, saw it as a short-sighted and punitive measure that sowed the seeds for future conflicts. Indeed, the harsh terms of the treaty, particularly the war guilt clause and the punitive reparations, are often cited as contributing factors to the rise of nationalism in Germany, and ultimately the outbreak of the Second World War. So, while the Great War may have ended in 1918, its echoes were heard long after the guns fell silent. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to ensure lasting peace, instead set the stage for another devastating conflict. The Great War was over, but its effects would be felt for generations to come. The Great War, as it was known then, reshaped the world in ways that are still felt today. It began with tensions in Europe, a powder keg of national ambitions and alliances waiting for the spark. And that spark came, igniting a conflict that would ravage nations and redefine warfare. The trenches became the symbol of this war, a quagmire of mud and blood where men faced death daily. The entry of the United States tipped the scales, bringing fresh troops and resources. The Treaty of Versailles marked the end, but not the resolution. The terms of the treaty laid the groundwork for future conflicts, sowing the seeds of resentment. Yet, beyond the geopolitical shifts, the war left an indelible mark on those who fought, a psychological trauma that would echo through generations. The echoes of the Great War still resonate, a reminder of the cost of conflict and the value of peace,